I'm freezing. Let me in, I beg. I'll reward you. The promises of the poor Apache woman. The sky above the high ridges of northern Arizona was dull steel, low, heavy, and motionless. Snow had been falling since morning. It wasn't the kind of flurry that passed through in an hour, but a steady, relentless curtain that blurred the tree line and covered everything with a thick silence. The wind wasn't screaming. It was worse than that. It was quiet and sharp, threading through the cracks of the pine woods and down into the isolated basin where the land flattened just enough for someone to live. John Merritt had been splitting logs since noon, his gloves stiff, shoulders tight from the cold that crept through even the wool-lined sleeves of his coat. 35 years old, broad-chested, worn down from the war and a life he didn't talk about. John lived here because it was far from other people. That was the point. The cabin was his and no one else's, a weather-beaten structure with warped shutters and snow pressed thick against its base. A year ago, he'd boarded over the second window after it cracked in a storm. 2 years before that, he'd buried his last dog beneath the sycamore near the barn. There weren't visitors. There weren't neighbors. Just trees, ice, and his quiet routines. He'd lived here since his wife died. That was almost 8 years back. Their boy hadn't made it to his second winter. After that, John stopped going to town more than once every season. No one came out this far unless they were lost, desperate, or planning something ugly. So when he heard the sound, that soft, irregular crunch in the snow, faint but real, his first instinct was caution. He straightened, axe still in hand, eyes narrowed on the woods beyond the fence. At first he thought it was an elk. Then he thought it might be a thief, or worse, a prospector or a rider from Holbrook straight off the trail. He didn't move, just listened, back rigid, boots half buried in drift. Then he saw her, a woman, thin, barefoot, buckskin dress torn and flapping at the hem. Her legs sank through the snow as she staggered toward the porch. One step, then another, arms clutched tight to her chest. Her hair was long and black, braided in one thick cord down her back. Her skin was dark brown, face windburned and tight. Not a settler. Apache. John's gut tensed immediately. Not from hatred. He wasn't that kind of man, but from what he knew. What he'd seen. Apache women didn't wander alone in white territory in the middle of winter, barefoot and near collapse, unless something had gone very wrong. He stepped toward her slowly, his mind already tracking possibilities. She could be bait. There could be others in the woods, waiting. But as she came closer, stumbling now, legs barely lifting through the snow, that thought started to fade. Her face was wrong for a trap. It was raw, exhausted, terrified. She dropped to her knees in the snow not 10 yards from his steps, her hands splaying into the drift, her body swaying like she'd pass out right there. He watched for another second, every instinct in him yelling for distance, warning him against stepping in. He didn't know her. Didn't know her. He lived quiet, and that quiet kept him alive. Then she looked up. "Please," she said. Her voice was dry and tight, barely audible, her lips cracked. "Let me in." John's jaw tightened. He didn't move. "I can reward you," she added, lower this time, teeth chattering. "Please." She had nothing. No pack, no boots, no visible weapon, no frostbite yet, but it was coming. Her fingers were stiff and red, her toes sunk deep in snow that must have burned like fire by now. John thought about walking back inside and bolting the door. He thought about staying quiet and letting nature do what it was already doing. Let the storm finish her. She'd be gone by morning, and no one would know. No risk, no complication, just the same quiet he always kept. But he didn't move away. Instead, he stepped forward. He crouched beside her, slowly, testing her reactions. She didn't flinch. She was past fear. Her face twisted slightly, not in panic, but in shame. She wasn't pleading now. She looked like she was waiting for judgment. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice even but low. She didn't answer. Her eyes fluttered closed for a second. Then she shook her head barely. John looked around once, into the trees, into the ridge, into the nothingness of cold white wilderness, and decided. He hooked one arm under her knees, the other behind her back, and lifted her. She was lighter than she should have been. Her body tensed against his chest, but she didn't fight him. She didn't speak again. He carried her to the porch, kicked the door open with his boot, and stepped inside. The warmth hit them immediately. Inside, the fire was steady, built strong before noon. A pot of beans simmered on the stove. The room was sparse, just shelves, a cot, a table, and the fire. It smelled like smoke and dust and pine. He set her down gently on the wool rug beside the hearth and went to grab the thickest blanket from his cot. She leaned against the stone of the fireplace, head tilted back, breathing shallow. Her eyes blinked open, trying to take in the room. She looked at the table, at the rifle on the wall, then at him again. Suspicion flickered in her eyes, but it was weak, dulled by exhaustion. John knelt beside her and began wrapping the blanket around her legs. "Keep your feet off the floor," he said. "You'll lose them if they stay that cold." Still nothing. He checked her hands. Her fingertips were chapped, the skin tight and red but not black. Not yet. He poured hot water from the kettle into a tin mug, added a pinch of salt and a dash of the honey he'd saved from last spring, and handed it to her. "Drink it slow. If you throw it up, I'm not cleaning it." She took the cup with both hands. They shook as she tried to lift it, but she managed. John sat back on his heels and watched her drink. Her throat moved with each swallow, slow and careful. Her eyes stayed on him, watching, waiting, but she didn't speak again. He didn't ask her name, didn't offer his. It was enough that she was here, that he hadn't left her out there to freeze. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know who she was or what she wanted. But he did know this. No one deserved to die like that, alone in the snow. He'd seen enough of that during the war. Too many. He didn't want company, didn't want conversation. But he also didn't walk away from people who couldn't stand on their own. Not anymore. The snow kept falling through the night. It coated the shutters in silence and buried the fences until only the tops of the posts showed through the drifts. The wind pushed against the cabin walls, trying to get in, but the logs held firm. Inside, the fire stayed lit, fed steadily by John's hand every hour. Tala hadn't said another word since she'd been brought in. She hadn't cried, either. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand anything, didn't even flinch when he unwrapped her legs and rubbed warmth back in her feet with cloth and water. She sat there, silent, leaning against the hearth, her eyes dull but watchful. At some point, she fell asleep with her knees tucked up and the wool blanket wrapped around her body. John hadn't moved her. He just laid another folded quilt beside her in case she woke cold. He watched her for a moment before sitting at the table with a plate of beans and bread. He ate without hurry, listening to the wood crackle and pop, watching the snow drift sideways across the window. His mind kept circling back to her. What tribe was she from? Why was she alone? How far had she walked, barefoot, through that snow? The cold could kill fast out here. He knew that better than most. A man couldn't last more than an hour barefoot in weather like this. And yet she had made it to his door, barely, but still breathing. Around midnight, she stirred. John glanced over. Her eyes were open, but she didn't look at him. She looked at the fire, then at her feet, which were bandaged and resting above a basin of warm water. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket a little tighter. "You're lucky they're still pink," John said, not unkindly. Another hour and they'd have been gone. Her eyes shifted to him slowly. This time, she spoke, low and rasped. "I walked 2 days." John frowned. "No boots." She shook her head. "Taken. When they cast me out." He didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't want to press, but he needed to understand. "Who cast you out?" "My people." That hung in the room for a long time. He could have asked why, but the way she said it, the weight of it, made it clear. She wasn't speaking for sympathy, just the truth. John nodded once. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. He stood, ladled some beans into a bowl, tore off a thick chunk of bread, and set it in front of her with a spoon. She took the bowl slowly, her hand still shaking. She didn't rush the food, just ate steady, every motion deliberate, like she'd been taught not to waste a single bite. She finished half the bowl before setting it aside and pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What's your name?" he asked. "Tala." He let that sit a moment. "I'm John." She gave a small nod, then turned her face slightly back to the fire. He watched her for a while, waiting to see if she'd speak more. She didn't. He noticed then what he hadn't fully caught before. Her clothes, what was left of them, were ceremonial. Apache-style dress, but the beading, the stitching, even the cut, was formal. It wasn't travel wear. It wasn't hunting wear. It was something worn at gatherings, rituals, or status events. It was torn, scuffed with pine sap, and thin enough to bleed heat out of her within minutes. "You were important," he said quietly. Tala's jaw tightened. Her gaze stayed on the fire. "Then, I was his wife." "Who's?" "The chief." John leaned back slightly. That explained the ceremonial cloth, the bone necklace, the sharpness in her posture, even now. But it didn't explain why a chief's wife had been left to die in the woods. "No children?" he asked, already guessing the answer. She looked at him then, sharp, defensive. "No, not with him." He didn't press. He just nodded once and leaned back in his chair. She took another small bite of bread, chewing slowly, not looking at him again. "You can stay here," he said, "until the weather breaks." She didn't thank him, just nodded once, quiet. He didn't expect gratitude. What mattered was survival, and she looked like she understood that too. Later that night, John unrolled a spare cot and set it up across the room near the stove. He placed a second blanket on top and gestured toward it. She moved slowly, every muscle tight with cold and caution, but she stood on her own. He watched her test her weight on her feet, wincing, biting back pain, but standing. That surprised him. Most people would be in tears. He turned away to give her privacy as she lay down. Then, for the first time since she'd come in, she spoke again. "You're alone too." He looked back toward her. She wasn't asking, just observing. He nodded. 8 years. She didn't ask what happened. He didn't tell her. They said nothing more. Outside, the wind picked up again. The world turned white beneath the moonlight. Inside, John fed the fire one more log and settled into his own cot. The quiet stretched out. It wasn't warm yet. Not between them, not completely, but it wasn't cold anymore either. She was there, alive, breathing. That was enough for now. By morning, the storm had buried the entire yard under another foot of snow. The fence line disappeared. Even the chicken coop was nearly sealed shut by a wind-carved drift. The sky stayed low and pale, heavy with more of the same. Cold like this didn't let up easily. Not up here. It pressed in day after day until the logs cracked in the walls and the water buckets froze solid if left unattended. John was already outside by dawn, clearing the path to the barn with a shovel. His breath came out in thick clouds, and his fingers, even gloved, stung as he worked. He checked on the cows, 2 of them, and shoveled fresh straw in their stalls. He didn't rush. That was part of staying alive out here. You did the work, steady, no matter how bad the wind bit. If he left it, the roof could collapse. If he waited too long, the livestock would suffer. And he wasn't about to let that happen. He hadn't fought through 2 winters up here just to lose it all to snow. Inside, Tala woke to the smell of ash and beans warming on the stove. Her legs still burned. Her toes, though painful, had some feeling again. She wiggled them beneath the blanket, her brow furrowed from both discomfort and the effort of gauging damage. Her hands were less raw now, but her mind wasn't any quieter. She looked around the cabin again, slower this time. The rifle on the wall, the way everything was positioned. No wasted space. Nothing decorative. A man's place. A man who didn't expect guests. She sat up, wrapped the blanket around her, and slowly tested her feet on the ground. Pain shot up her calves, but she could bear it. She limped to the stove, holding on to the table for balance. That's where John found her when he stepped back in, her back to him, one hand braced on the edge of the stove as she tried to ladle food from the pot. "You should have waited," he said flatly, stepping inside and kicking the door closed behind him. She didn't turn. "I'm not helpless." He didn't argue with that. He took off his gloves, unwrapped his scarf, and moved toward the basin to wash up. "That doesn't mean you're not injured." She finally looked over her shoulder, her face guarded but calm. "I can do small things." John gave a brief nod. "All right, just don't fall over." He dried his hands and came over to adjust the flame. She moved aside, allowing him to finish ladling 2 bowls. He handed her one without ceremony. They ate at the table again, this time together. Still quiet. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't tight with uncertainty. It was practical. Midway through the meal, John asked what had been on his mind all morning. "Where were you trying to go?" Tala chewed slowly before answering. "I wasn't." He frowned slightly. "So what then?" "I just walked." He didn't understand. "Into the snow? With no food or boots?" She looked at him steadily. "I wasn't supposed to live." The room went still. John's hand tightened around the tin cup. He didn't ask the next question. He didn't need to. She'd answer enough. "You were cast out to die." Tala nodded. "It's what's done." He stared at the table. That kind of thinking didn't sit right with him. He'd seen war. He'd seen cruelty. But this, turning your back on someone because they couldn't bear children, leaving them in winter to starve, it worked against everything he believed a life should be. "You don't strike me as someone who gives up," he said finally. Tala's face twitched, barely, but her voice stayed even. "I didn't want to die, but I accepted it." John didn't know what to say to that. There wasn't a right answer. He stood up, cleared the bowls, and set them in the wash basin. "You can stay here," he said again, firmer this time. "Long as you need. I got room." Tala looked at him. Really looked. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer her anything he couldn't keep. That afternoon, she asked for a knife. John hesitated. "What for?" "My hair," she said, pointing to the frayed ends of her braid. "It's tangled and dirty. I don't want to carry the past on my back." He nodded once and handed her his small utility blade. She took it without ceremony and went to sit by the fire. He didn't watch her do it. But later, he saw the black braid laid out on the floor beside the coals. She had trimmed it short, clean and even, just below the shoulders. Her eyes were calmer afterward. That evening, she helped peel potatoes while he salted meat. She moved slowly but didn't complain. She never asked questions about his past, about the woman whose photograph sat face down on the shelf, or about the years he'd spent alone in this place. And he didn't ask her about the chief, or how long she'd been his wife, or how many times she'd tried to give him a child. But he noticed something else. Her hands weren't clumsy. They moved with skill, practiced from years of work. This wasn't someone who'd lived soft. She'd skinned animals, built fires, cleaned hides. She'd known labor. That night, after the fire burned low, she asked quietly, "Did your wife die here?" John sat in the chair by the fire, arms crossed. His jaw tightened, but he answered, "No, fever, down in Holbrook. My boy caught it too." Tala nodded slowly. "You stayed here after." He met her eyes. There wasn't anything left down there worth staying for. The silence stretched again. But this one wasn't awkward. It felt understood. "You're not like most white men," she said finally. John didn't respond. He didn't take it as praise. Just a fact. "You're not like most," she repeated. He got up, stirred the fire back to life, and went to check the shutters. Behind him, Tala watched. Not in fear, not in suspicion. For the first time, she wasn't waiting to be sent away. And for the first time, John didn't feel like she was temporary. The snow had started to settle into hard crusts by the fourth morning. Temperatures had stayed low enough that nothing melted, but the blizzard winds had eased. Still no clear skies, but there was less urgency in the cold. John noticed at first when his axe didn't stick with every swing, when the barn door didn't freeze shut by mid-morning, and when the cows were moving easier, huffing clouds of breath, but not huddling close to the walls anymore. Inside, things had shifted too, slowly, subtly. Tala no longer needed help to stand. She still limped, but she moved around the cabin on her own, fetching kindling, helping peel vegetables, straightening the bedding without being asked. She didn't speak much, but John had stopped waiting for her to. When she did speak, her voice was calmer, grounded. John had added another log to the fire when he heard it, an awkward scraping of metal and a muttered breath. He turned and saw her struggling to carry the water bucket from the stove to the wash basin. It was too heavy, and her grip weak from cold-damaged fingers. "You don't have to do that," he said, crossing the room. "I want to," she replied, keeping her eyes on the bucket as it tipped slightly. "Let me do something." He took it from her anyway, not as dismissal but with steady hands, pouring it without spilling. She didn't fight him, just took a step back and stood quietly until it was done. Then she said it, out of nowhere. voice low but firm. "It wasn't me." John turned toward her, confused. "I wasn't the one who couldn't give him children," she clarified. "He was old, older than my father." John didn't interrupt. "He chose me for ceremony. They said I was a blessing. But when seasons passed and there was no child," she trailed off. "He couldn't let them think it was him." John sat down across from her at the table. "So he blamed you?" Tala nodded once. "And they believed him. Did you know for sure?" He asked carefully. "About him? I knew," she said. "There was a boy before. Years ago, when I was 15. He was close to my age. We didn't stay together long. It was secret. I lost that baby early. No one knew." Her voice didn't crack. It wasn't a confession. It was fact. She wasn't ashamed of it. Not anymore. She said it to set the record straight. For herself. For whatever came next. John didn't judge her. He'd seen worse done by better men. Tala looked down at her hands. "When the bleeding returned 2 moons ago, I knew I was still able. But it didn't matter anymore. I'd already been cast out." John nodded slowly. That explained the timing. Why she looked barely alive when she arrived. She'd been left with no time to prepare. Just turned out. A body with no purpose in their eyes. No one checking if she had food or boots. He stood and went to the shelf. From a box wrapped in oilskin, he pulled a clean bar of lye soap, a comb, and a spare set of wool socks, plain gray, worn but thick. He set them on the table near her without a word. She looked at them a long moment, then met his eyes. "Thank you." It was the first time she'd said it. She didn't say it lightly. That afternoon, John worked on repairing the coop outside, while Tala stayed inside and washed her hair with melted snow water. He didn't see it, but when he came in later, she had braided it clean, tied with a short length of twine, her posture straighter. The torn ceremonial dress she'd arrived in was now layered with one of his flannel shirts, sleeves rolled and hem tucked under a belt. She still walked like someone guarding her steps, but there was purpose in it now. That evening, while the stew simmered, John asked the question that had been lingering since day one. "You planning to go back?" "When a thaw comes." Tala didn't answer immediately. She stirred the pot, eyes fixed on the steam, then said, "There's nowhere to go." "What about your tribe?" "They're not mine anymore." He waited, but she didn't elaborate. He didn't push her. "You've lived here long?" she asked after a while. 7 years. 8, maybe. "Why here?" "After the war, I came west. I want to land. Quiet. Got both." "Your wife, did she like it?" "She never saw it. I was building this place when she died." Tala's face didn't change, but she sat down quietly across from him. "I'm sorry." He gave a small nod. "You're not the only one who's lost something." They ate together again, this time with less silence between them. She asked about the cows, the garden. He showed her the cellar and where the smoked meat was stored. They talked about work, not about feelings. That was the way they both understood things best. Before bed, she stood near the window, watching the snowfall lighten into a fine drift. John said, "Spring's still a long ways off. But if you stay through it, I'll help you build something." She turned toward him slowly. "What do you mean? A shed? Or a room off the side of the cabin? So you have your own space. Doesn't have to be temporary." She studied his face. Not surprised, just measuring the weight of it. "You're offering me a place?" "I'm offering you the choice." She didn't answer then. But when she lay down that night, she didn't wrap herself in the blanket as tightly. And for the first time since she arrived, she slept without fear in her eyes. The days began to stretch slightly longer, though the sun still barely made it over the ridge before dipping behind the trees again. A weak thaw touched the edges of the snowpack near the cabin, but only during the warmest hours. Icicles clung to the roof, and the wind still carried the bite of deep winter. But something had shifted inside, something steady, quiet, and new. Tala had started waking before John. She didn't make noise or take up space, just moved about the cabin with quiet hands, rekindling the stove, checking the water buckets, wiping down the table. Her limp was still there, but lighter. And with each morning she stayed, the air between them settled a little more. John noticed details without trying. How she folded the blankets, how she handled the knife while slicing potatoes, how she touched everything like it belonged to her, but never once assumed it did. He had never known a woman like that. Not since his wife. Not with that kind of presence. One morning, as they ate side by side, Tala looked up and asked, "Do you still go into town?" He wiped the edge of his mouth with his sleeve and nodded. "Once every few weeks. Sometimes longer, depending on the weather." "Is it far?" 15 miles if the trail's clear. 20 if I have to go around the ridge. People there know you. They know I keep to myself." She didn't ask to go. She didn't ask about the people. But her questions told him she was thinking ahead, past survival. Later that day, John brought down a pile of old lumber from the loft above the barn. He started laying it out beside the cabin. Rough boards, some warped from age, others still usable. She stood on the porch, arms crossed against the cold, watching him. "You meant it," she said after a while. "About building something. I don't say things I don't mean." She stepped down onto the snow-packed ground and moved beside him. "Then let me help." "You sure?" She nodded. He handed her a hammer and began showing her how the framing would be done. Simple, strong, nothing fancy. Just enough space for a small room on the side of the cabin. A place she could sleep in if she wanted privacy, or use however she wanted if she stayed. It wasn't a gesture of control. It was one of permanence. As they worked, she asked questions about the wood, the nails, how to keep boards flush. She learned fast, her hands still rough and unsteady, but determined. He saw her grit her teeth when her foot ached, but she never sat down. Not once. That evening, back inside, he handed her a tin cup of warm cider and said, "You don't have to prove anything." She looked at him across the flickering light of the fire. "I'm not proving. I'm choosing." John nodded, understanding that more than he could say. That night, after dinner, he retrieved a small bundle from the cabinet, his wife's old coat. It had been wrapped in cloth for years, left untouched. It was wool-lined, patched at the shoulders, but still solid. He placed it beside Tala without speaking. She looked at it, then at him. "Whose was it?" "My wife's," he said quietly. "She wants someone using it. It's just sitting otherwise." Tala didn't refuse. She picked it up gently, hands smoothing over the cloth like it was fragile. She tried it on. It was large on her, but warm. She nodded once. "Thank you." That was all. No big exchange. No sentimentality. The next morning, she wore it when they walked to check the traps John had set near the tree line. It was the first time she'd left the yard since arriving. She moved slow but sure, the cold no longer something that consumed her, but something she could endure. As they walked back, John said, "You said there was a child before." Tala looked at the snow beneath her boots. "Yes. Do you want one again?" She stopped walking. Her face didn't change much, but her shoulders lifted slightly, like she hadn't expected the question, like it stirred something she hadn't let herself think about. "I used to," she said finally. "Then I stopped believing I ever could again." John didn't speak. He just waited. Then she said, quieter, "But now I wonder if it was never me." He nodded. "Might not have been." Tala kept walking. After a few steps, she added, "If I ever had one, I'd want it to be born in a place like this. Not under ceremony. Not for someone's title. Just for its own life." John didn't say anything, but his chest felt tight in a way he hadn't known in years. That night, as they finished supper, he did something he hadn't done in nearly a decade. He sat beside her at the table, leaned slightly closer, and said her name. Not as a question, not to get her attention, just to say it. "Tala." She looked up calm. He nodded once, slow. Then, with no hesitation, she leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't showy. Just steady, quiet, real. She pulled back only slightly, looked him in the eye, and said, "I'm not leaving." And John, who had spent 8 years expecting everyone to eventually walk away, said softly, "Good." The kiss hadn't changed the weather. Snow still clung to the pines. The wind still whispered through the cracks in the cabin walls. But something inside had shifted, and not just in silence or looks. Tala didn't act differently the next morning. She still rose early, still fed the stove, still moved through the small space without assuming anything had changed. But she stood a little closer when they spoke. Her eyes didn't drift away when John looked at her. And when their hands touched by accident at the basin or table, neither one pulled back. John noticed it. Every movement, every breath. They were two people who had lost too much to rush anything. But now there was a door open, and both of them had stepped through it. That morning, they worked side by side outside again. The extension to the cabin was halfway framed, the ground beneath the snow already packed down for the base. Tala stood on the planks beside him, holding up one end of a board while he hammered it into place. Her cheeks were red with cold. Strands of hair stuck to her jaw, but she looked strong, present. John's thoughts kept circling the same thing as he worked. Her saying, "I'm not leaving." He hadn't asked what that meant in full, whether it meant staying for the season or staying forever. But deep down, he already knew. She didn't say things she didn't mean, and neither did he. That evening, after the fire was going strong and supper was cleaned up, Tala sat in the cot she still used at night. She was combing out her hair, slowly, carefully. John sat at the table, oiling the hinges of his trap box. The quiet between them was easy. Then she asked, "Do you miss her?" He didn't pretend not to understand. He set down the cloth, thought for a moment, and said, "I did, for a long time." Tala waited, not pressing. She was kind, he said. Sick a lot, though. Got worse after the baby came. He didn't last the winter. Tala's hands slowed. "That's why you built this place." "I needed distance. From everything. I didn't want reminders." She nodded. "And now?" John looked at her. "Now it doesn't feel like I'm running anymore." She kept brushing her hair. "You let me in," she said. "Not just through the door." John stood slowly, crossed the room, and crouched in front of her. She didn't stop combing, but her eyes met his. "You came here with nothing," he said. "I saw you dying in the snow, and you still didn't beg. You stood up, even when you could barely walk. That kind of strength." He stopped. She watched him. He reached forward and took the comb from her hand, set it aside gently, and touched her jaw with quiet fingers. She didn't flinch. She leaned in slightly, just enough. He kissed her again, this time slower, longer. Her hand moved to his chest, resting lightly over the cloth of his shirt. When they pulled apart, she whispered, "I want this, but I want it to be on my terms." John nodded, serious. "It always will be." They sat like that for a moment, close but not rushed. Then she stood and walked to the fire, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. John followed. The wind pressed gently against the cabin walls. No longer a threat, just part of the rhythm. That night, they lay in the same bed for the first time. Tala climbed beneath the quilt without hesitation, her bare feet brushing his. John held her close, but didn't try to claim her. He just kept his arms around her, steady, present. Their bodies moved together quietly, without ceremony, without urgency. It was not about heat or hunger. It was slow, steady, a meeting of survival and choice. The fire cracked behind them, casting soft light across the wooden walls. When it was done, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Later, in the dark, Tala whispered, "If I carry a child this time, it will not belong to anyone but me." John's voice came soft against her hair. "It'll belong to both of us, but no one else." She didn't reply, but the way she settled against him said everything. Outside, the snow began to fall again, gently this time. And for the first time in years, neither of them felt cold. The days grew lighter now, subtle but noticeable. The frost on the cabin windows didn't linger past midday, and the roof started dripping near the edges when the sun came out. John marked it all the same way he always had, by the changing habits of the animals. The hens were laying more regular again. The cows were restless at sunrise. The pines around the ridge shook loose their weight in snow with every strong gust. Inside the cabin, things had settled into a rhythm that neither of them named out loud, but both had come to understand. They shared the bed now. Tala no longer returned to the cot, and John no longer pretended this was temporary. The mornings began with quiet routines, John chopping wood or hauling feed, Tala boiling water, checking the supplies, washing linens. She wore his shirt layered over the patched coat he had given her, and her hands, though still marked from the cold weeks past, moved without hesitation now. One morning, as he returned from the barn, John found her sitting at the table, staring at her hands. She wasn't sick. She wasn't in pain. But something in her face had changed, something quiet and inward. He stepped inside, hung his coat, and asked, "What is it?" She looked up slowly, hesitated, then said, "It's been weeks. I haven't bled." John didn't move for a moment. His eyes met hers, searching. "You're sure?" Tala nodded. "Yes." Neither one said anything for a while. John crossed the room, pulled out a chair, and sat beside her. His expression stayed serious, not alarmed, not overwhelmed, just focused. "You think it's him?" he asked, careful with his tone. "I know it wasn't me," she said softly. John exhaled through his nose, thinking. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't looking for celebration. What she wanted was truth. Solid ground beneath her feet. "You feel all right?" he asked. "Better than I thought I would. I've had no sickness, but I can feel something different. Deep." John placed his hand gently over hers. "Then we plan for that. Together." She turned her hand in his and gripped it tightly. "If it's true, if it grows, I want this child to live like we do. Not in fear. Not under someone's name. Just here. With you. With me." John nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." They didn't rush to make more of it. No sudden talk of names. No ceremony. But the next day, John reinforced the windows of the new room they'd been building. He added a second layer of insulation, used the best wood for the joints. He didn't say it was for the baby, but she knew, and she started sewing scraps of fabric together, quietly, in the evenings, stitching with calm, steady hands. She didn't say what it was for, but he knew. One morning, while they were preparing to check the traps, John asked a question he'd been turning over in his mind for days. "You said before that no one knew about the first child you lost." Tala paused while buttoning her coat. "That's right. Do you want people to know now?" She didn't answer at first. Then she turned to him and said, "Not people. Just one. Your mother?" he guessed. She nodded. "She's still in the tribe. She didn't fight for me when they turned me out, but she cried. I saw it. She didn't have the power to stop it, but she knew it was wrong." John nodded slowly. "Then when the thaw comes, we'll go down the mountain. Leave word with the trading post. Quietly. Someone will bring it back to her." Tala's eyes filled, not with tears, but with something else. Relief. "I just want her to know I lived," she said. "That I didn't die in the snow." John stepped close, touched her cheek. "We'll make sure she knows." Later that week, a coyote got too close to the chicken coop. John shot it from the porch, clean through the shoulder. Tala stood beside him afterward, watching the animal go still in the drift. "Most men would have killed it outright," she said. "It wasn't hunting," he replied. "It was starving. You've seen too much death to chase more of it." He looked at her. "Haven't you?" Tala nodded. "That's why I'm here." That night, they lay side by side, the fire low, the new room still half finished but dry. She whispered, "This child will be born into stillness. Not ceremony, not fire." John tightened his arm around her waist. "Born into choice." Tala closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to rest fully. Spring was still far off, but inside, something was already growing, quiet, unseen, alive. The thaw came slowly, as it always did this high in the pines. Not with warmth, but with signs, tree sap glistening along bark, icicles shortening, the cabin's roof beginning to drip steadily at midday. The snow still held, deep and stubborn in the shaded places, but the hard edge of winter had dulled. Birds returned in cautious pairs. Squirrels chased each other again across the limbs. Inside, the stillness remained, but now it was filled with movement. Tala's belly had begun to change. Barely, not yet a full swell, but enough for her to feel the pull in her core when she bent, the heaviness in her center. She said little about it, but John noticed. The way she paused more often when walking. The way her hand drifted toward her lower stomach without thinking. He didn't point it out. He simply adjusted, took on more of the lifting, stacked extra firewood closer to the door, made sure her chair by the hearth was always warm. He'd also finished the extra room. The door creaked faintly on new hinges. The floor still smelled of sawdust. It was plain, one cot, a chest, a small table near the window, but it belonged to her. Not just as a space, as a sign. Tala stood in it one morning, alone, eyes scanning the walls. She didn't say it, but she remembered what it had meant to be denied a space of her own, to be moved through her old tribe's lodge like a vessel, valuable only in ceremony, discarded in failure. This room wasn't big, but it was hers. Built for her, not for what she could provide. And now, even as she carried life again, it felt different. Not demanded. Chosen. John leaned on the doorframe as she stood there. "I can fix a small shelf here," he said, pointing to the far wall. "If you want." She turned. "You built this for me. I won't ask for more." "You don't have to ask," he said. "You live here now." It wasn't a grand statement. Just truth, said plainly. That afternoon, they walked down the slope together, tracing the trail toward the distant path that would eventually lead to the Holbrook trading post. John had a bundle of supplies on his shoulder, dried meat, a pouch of silver coins, a folded note. Tala had written it carefully the night before, sitting by the fire, her hand steady even as her eyes occasionally drifted toward the flame. The letter was for her mother. She didn't write much, just that she had lived, that she had not died in the snow, that she was warm now, safe, and not alone. She didn't name John. She didn't speak of the child, but she wrote enough for the truth to reach her. They left the letter and bundle in a hollow stump by the fork in the trail, the place where traders often passed through to collect hides or goods. It would be taken. Someone would know who to give it to. And when it was gone, Tala didn't look back. That night, John made venison stew. Tala sliced onions, pausing occasionally to press her hand to her ribs when the child shifted beneath her skin. It was a small thing, a flicker, but real. After they ate, John pulled a small pouch from the shelf and sat beside her. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "It's not much, just a few keepsakes." She opened it carefully. Inside was a silver ring, plain, wide-banded, no jewel, and a tiny wooden carving of a pine tree. "She gave me that before I went to war," John said. "Told me if I made it through, I should use it when I found someone who stayed." Tala looked at the ring, her fingers tracing the smooth metal. Then she looked at him. "I've already chosen you," she said. John nodded. "I know, but I want you to know I've chosen you too. And this isn't about what we've lost. It's about what we're building." Tala closed the pouch and held it to her chest. He leaned in slowly, kissed her, quiet and certain. Then she placed his hand on her stomach. He rested it there, still and reverent, as if he were holding something sacred, not because of ceremony, but because it was real, something that had survived. That night, the wind shifted. The trees no longer groaned, they breathed. Inside, Tala slept with her back against John's chest, the quilt tucked tight around them both. And for the first time since the day she'd been turned out barefoot into the snow, her body did not brace against the night. It welcomed it, because now the cold could not reach her. By mid-April, the last of the snow had melted from the lower trails. The air was still sharp in the mornings, but by noon, the ground was soft underfoot and the pines dripped with meltwater. John had moved the cows back toward the west pasture, where shoots of green had begun to push up through the damp soil. Every day now brought a sound that hadn't been heard in months: running water, bird song, insects tapping on glass. Inside the cabin, life had changed in ways John hadn't imagined a season ago. The space no longer felt like a shelter built for one man's grief. It felt lived in. Tala's work basket sat under the table, filled with mending she never rushed. His shirts hung on the line beside her flannel wrap. The new room he'd built wasn't just finished now. It was painted with soft strokes of color she had made herself, using crushed bark and plant dyes. The small shelf he had offered to build was up, and on it sat the wooden pine carving John's mother once gave him. Tala moved slower these days. Her belly had rounded clearly, visible beneath the wrap she wore around her waist. She didn't complain, she never had, but John saw the way she paced herself, how she rested more often between tasks, how she sometimes stood by the open window with one hand bracing the frame and the other gently over her stomach. One morning, he brought her a basin of warm water and a cloth without being asked. She sat by the stove, soaking her feet, her face calm but thoughtful. "You never asked for any of this," she said quietly. "I didn't have to," John replied. "You came." She looked up at him. "Are you ready?" "I'm not afraid," he said. "That's enough." She reached for his hand and guided it over the curve of her belly. The child stirred beneath his palm, stronger now, not just flutters but a slow, turning pressure. He didn't speak. He only nodded, and she knew. That same afternoon, They walked together to the edge of the ridge, where the land dipped down toward the basin. From there, they could see far into the valley. John pointed out the new bloom near the creek, and Tala picked a small sprig of wild mint. She pressed it between her fingers and smiled faintly. That was the first time he saw her smile without effort, open without holding back. On the way back, Tala stopped at the stump where they'd left the message for her mother. It was gone. In its place was a strip of woven cloth, a small sash, deep red, the color of her old lodge's ceremonial thread. She picked it up with both hands. There were no words, no note, just a cloth. She got it, she whispered. John watched her closely. Is it a good sign? She nodded slowly. It means I'm no longer ghosted. I am remembered. They walked home in silence, but it wasn't empty. The air felt full of something old being settled. That evening, Tala prepared a stew with the last of the carrots they'd stored through winter. She moved carefully, pausing once as the child kicked hard, her hand steadying herself against the table. John rose from his chair, moved behind her, and supported her waist. I've got you, he said. You always do, she murmured, then leaned back into him. Later, when the fire was low and the dishes washed, she took his hand, led him to their bed, and lay beside him, drawing the quilt up over them both. In the quiet that followed, she turned toward him. You never asked if I wanted to marry you, she said, voice soft. I figured I didn't need to. We already chose each other. She smiled again, smaller this time. Still, ask me. John looked into her eyes, steady and without hesitation. Will you be my wife? Tala nodded once. I already am. The child shifted again, and John placed his hand over her belly like he had many nights before. But this time he said aloud, Our child. She covered his hand with hers and whispered, Our family. Spring settled in for good by the following week. The buds on the trees turned to leaves. The hens clucked in the yard, fat and loud again. And the cabin, once just a place of exile and quiet survival, was now a home. Rooted, alive, Tala stayed. John stayed. The child would be born in a few short moons, in the room they built together, in a house where no one would be cast out for failing to meet expectations. In this place, there were no titles, no demands, only presence, choice, and care. And for the first time in both their lives, that was enough.